Hey, and welcome to Tech Tips with Sold Out Media. I'm Amanda, and joining me today is one of my very favorite friends, Fredrik Claesson. And why Fred is so significant in the guest range is we actually started off knowing nothing together about television.
Yes.
Right? Fred's older brother was in charge of a TV station that Fred's father started. And we sort of got thrown into so much together, and the learning process kind of went along with it. You were with me in Canada, and you learned some in South Africa. You went to a media school there.
Yes, did a video production school in South Africa, did our internship in Canada with Eastlink.
So to give you a little backstory, Fred's been along my journey for a long time. So today, we're going to talk about lenses.
Yes.
Right? And lens choices. Fred's the guy that really can actually grasp what the story is and how we need to tell it just from talking to somebody. And lenses are an important part of that. When you choose your lenses, you're choosing it based on your story, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're always trying to give the narrative, your story, the best possible way of reaching someone's heart. And the lenses help tell that story because lenses are basically like the eye of the camera. And because your eye and a camera eye is not the same thing, they do different things to the story. When you put a different lens on, it changes the story, or it can change the story. And we need to be aware of this and choose our lenses appropriately.
And he's always happy, he's always fun. The kids love him because he's always smiling.
I want my life to be a sermon, I guess, because I've never considered myself a great preacher. Maybe that's how I sort of make up for it, right? So if I can't really preach all that well up on the stage, at least my life could be a sermon. And maybe that's where we would kind of speak the most.
My first set of lenses I bought really basically because I thought I had to cover the whole range. So I got a 10 to 20 wide angle lens, and then I got a 24 to 70 mid-range lens, and all the way up to 400 millimeters because I assumed that was the way to go. But it wasn't the correct way to go at all. If you don't understand what the story is. So my 10 to 20 I almost never used, and my 400 mil I only use if I do bird photography now, which is never, right? So Fred, how do we tell the story with the lenses?
Well, that actually also begins with understanding the composition, right? You have the wide shot, which introduces a subject in context to where he is in the story, what the story is about. You have the waist shot or the medium shot that really focuses in on the person and has the more normal view for the viewer. And then there's the bust shot, which is here, which is the more intimate way of telling the story. And all of these things matter when you choose your lenses, because some lenses do other parts of the story better than others.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a wide angle lens, well, that's very suitable for having a wide shot. But of course, it depends on how you want to tell the story too. But it works really well of presenting people, following people, showing motion, and a bigger picture. A normal lens, which is between 35 and 50 millimeters, that works really well for just presenting everyday, normal life kind of stories and bringing you into a more inclusive feel, more natural feel as being part of the story. And you can work with those a lot.
And if I had to choose one lens that I had to take with me, I only got one, it would be the 24 to 70 because I can give a wide perspective of the overall scene, but then I can get in nice and close to my subject enough to have those emotional connections with them. And that's really where you want to be. Nobody wants to watch a story where it's just wide shot after wide shot after wide shot. You want to make a connection from your subject to the viewer, you guys. Right? And the way to do that is to have this close contact with them.
When you're talking about lenses, especially for video, photography is slightly different, but especially for video, the f-stop is the aperture that you can shoot at. And when talking about zoom lenses, whether they be wide angle zoom lenses with like 13 to 24, or if you're talking a normal zoom lens between 24 and 70, or telephoto zoom between 70 and 200, if you buy a cheaper lens or you don't look carefully, you'll get a lens that has a variable focal length, which means when you're zoomed out, it'll start at like 3.5 for aperture, which is letting a lot of light in. But when you then zoom in, it'll go up to like f-stop 5.6, most often than not. And you're choking the light. So when you're shooting something and you want to move into the picture by zooming into it, and you have one of those lenses, immediately your image changes.
Absolutely.
Or if you're on auto on your camera, your shutter speed will change or your ISO will change, and the image will look weird in some form or way. And you have to be aware of this.
And when you're doing a multi-camera edit afterwards, you know, you want as much similarity shot to shot as possible. Now, sensor size is something else that comes into play. Like I said, my go-to lens now on the R is a 24-70. It's a full-frame camera, right? Whereas on the APS-C sensor, it was a 17-50.
And that would be the cameras that are the 60Ds, the 70Ds, and like in that number range. I think the ADD as well is an APS-C sensor.
But when picking your lens, again, you want to try to understand what kind of feel you're doing. Doing regular television or day-to-day stories, again, the 70 or the 24-70 gets me there. But if I was going to tell a more dramatic cinematic story, maybe I would want a wide-angle lens to show separation between two subjects, or to show, with a telephoto lens, maybe somebody off in the distance and blowing the background way out. Do you know what I mean? Like you get different effects from the different lenses. And that's where you should be buying your lenses and making your lens choices. Don't just go out and try to buy, like I did, a whole range of lenses, and then the two top ends you never use, right?
Yeah. No, it's about understanding the story. You can learn a lot of this from watching more tech tip videos or watching other people who do like videos on tech and how video works. But ultimately, I'm sorry to say, this is something that you'll have to find out as you go as well, because your way of telling a story is often unique, and you'll have to find your way of doing it, and then you'll also learn the grammar of video, how it works with shots and storytelling and all those things. And then you'll go, oh, but I might need this to complement how I tell my stories. So when we started out working together with actually shooting video on DSLRs, we had a camera that was Canon 5D Mark II. And I had bought a wide-angle lens, mid-zoom lens, and a telephoto lens. But what I also had was a few prime lenses. And the prime lenses go down to like f-stop 1.4 and 1.2. And they are just fantastic for sharpness and putting things like in their own, like I'm really focusing on this one subject. And zoom lenses generally can't do that as well.
No.
But for portraits and storytelling of really fixing your story, those are beautiful as well.
Absolutely. But again, you have to understand, if you have one of those lenses, if your subject is moving a lot,
Oh, it's so difficult.
right? Because that depth of field is so pinpoint.
Yeah, we're talking like maybe 2 centimeters. And just from in this, if I do this, you could get out of focus. And we had that happen. So we generally didn't shoot at 1.4, but you could use it as an effect. Now, and speaking of prime lenses and talking about sensor sizes too, about your story, because this happened when we got the Canon 5D, we moved up from a smaller sensor, an APS-C, up to a full frame. And I hadn't thought about something called the crop factor, which is the smaller sensor. Basically, you have to do a math, which is 1.6 times the number. So a 50 millimeter lens on a full format camera actually becomes closer to an 80 millimeter lens on an APS-C. So you're adding more zoom to the lenses. And unless you have bought proper lenses, you're gonna end up wondering when you move to the full format camera, what happened to my shots? Because they're all so zoomed out.
Right, because you went the opposite way. So your 50 ended up becoming more like a 35 when you went from the APS-C.
It felt like it. It wasn't, but it felt like it.
It felt like it.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Now, we also wanted to tell you a little bit about video. So we're using broadcast cameras here at the television station, and lens choice has always been kind of an argument. There's a balance, right? In the long run, we end up paying more for the lenses than we do the cameras themselves. We were looking at these sporty box lenses that you can get this incredible depth of field. You can do things with a box lens.
And zoom range too.
Zoom range that you couldn't do with any other lens. And we're talking about pieces of glass that are, you know, big pieces of glass.
Yeah.
The price for it though, $250,000 US, right? These kind of things in video, they play a big part because again, if you're in a stadium, you don't always have the luxury of being right next to the stage. So a 200 mil DSLR lens isn't going to get you there.
It doesn't even have to be a stadium. It's enough with it being a semi-large church. That's it. And because most likely you're not going to be able to stand in front of the stage. I mean, you can't stay in front of the pulpit if you have people in a crowd when they're worshiping and when they're listening to a sermon, or if you're doing a small seminar, with someone doing a lecture, you can't be there. You have to be further back to not distract from the subject, right?
Yeah.
And you can't do that with those lenses. So either you need huge amounts of zoom, which you won't use more often than that. And it's hard. So for us working with TV and those kinds of cameras, broadcast cameras, having a box lens is absolutely amazing, both in the studio, but also outside for larger venues.
Absolutely. And how fast they are too.
Oh, so fast.
I mean, you could zoom in what would be, I'm just trying to think, over 300 feet. You could zoom in over 300 feet just by flicking your wrist.
Yeah.
And it's like that. And then you can focus almost instantly.
Yeah.
They're so fast. So again, when you're making your choice, depending on the camera, depending on the sensor of the camera, here in the studio, we went from having secondhand box lenses from SVT, yeah. They were gorgeous, but when we switched to HD, the HD version of the box lenses here in Sweden is 2 million crowns a piece, right? And so we ended up going with a cheaper lens. And you never ever could achieve the same depth of field with our broadcast cameras as we could with the DSLRs, which is why we started being lured over to the DSLRs.
Yeah.
Lots of cheaper glass. I mean, we're talking about a lens this big instead of a lens this big.
And cheap is very subject to where you are, right? Like we say cheap, but really for a private person, they're still not cheap. Like a lens for a camera that you want to use for video, for a DSLR, will run you maybe like 30,000 kroners, between 20 and 30,000 for a good telephoto lens that has a good f-stop aperture. But talking about that comparatively to a studio camera where the lenses cost 2 million kroners, it's a way different thing, right? So even when we were changing to HD, we bought one lens that we need, or two lenses that we needed separately. One was 70,000 kroners and one was 80,000.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of money, and we felt that we were stretching it so thin.
Yeah, exactly.
And we still couldn't get the shot that we really wanted.
No, exactly.
Because the sensor size was too small and the lens did not have enough glass.
Exactly. But again, one was a wide lens and one was a zoom lens.
Yeah.
Right? So we could have the ability to tell the story. The other cameras had the more stock model lens on at basic levels, but we knew we needed to be able to get the stories, a wide angle lens and a good telephoto lens, so we could try to get in and really get the emotions in some of our shows.
But that was where the money is. Because, moving on to the next thing, which is the quality of lenses will affect something called chromatic aberrations. And chromatic aberrations has to do really with one thing only, and it's the clarity of lenses. And it's costly to make lenses, and it's hard factory labor, machine labor, but it's hard to make lenses that are good. And if you're looking at really clear lenses, even for photography, you're still talking about 50,000. And you're moving to video, and if you're talking about Hollywood and video, like film sensors,
ARRI lenses,
like ARRI lenses,
oh man,
you're talking about more money than that. And
even an ARRI light costs more than some of our cameras.
Yeah, and that's like the lenses
and that's because the lens on that.
Yeah, and that's because the clarity, and it just has to do with how much can you buff them, and what protection layers can you put on them, how can you coat them, and how can you work with getting them inside the actual packaging of it so that it doesn't get dust on it. If it's not sharpened and if it's not buffed and protected, when you get into high contrast situations, like someone standing close to a tree, that's the most common where you see it, and there's some foliage in the tree and the sun is coming through and it looks great, but with a bad lens, you'll see on the edges of the things that are in contrast, you'll see purple and green light. It'll look like a really fuzzy shadow, and that's because the lens hasn't been buffed up enough. And so look at the lenses and be aware that you might want to check out what reviews they have and how they work with that stuff and working in different light situations. Luckily though, the tint is something you can change in photography fairly easy, and if you do your video calibration and white balance, it works to get away with it. But it's always hard when you have to do extra work for a lens that doesn't work with the rest of the group.
No, exactly.
So
only other thing we think that you should consider when you're purchasing your lens, and it comes back again to understanding how you're telling your story, is lens compression.
Yeah.
Now, lens compression, some people say it's a phenomena, not so much something that has to do with the lens you're buying, and that is in one way true. You can achieve, for example, the same shot with a telephoto lens as a wide-angle lens, depending on the distance from the subject, right? So, for example, if we put somebody in frame in a telephoto lens and shoot a shot, and we have a wide-angle lens at the exact same distance away as the telephoto lens and take the same shot. When you crop in post-production, you can actually get those two shots to look the same.
Almost the same.
Almost the same. But if you move the camera, the wide-angle lens,
To get the framing
the framing the same. So you move it closer to the subject, that's when you start to see this distortion
Well, the background changes a lot.
of the background.
Because what happens with a telephoto lens is that it crops the information in the background and brings the background closer to the subject. If you're moving the wide-angle lens closer in, you're going to get a lot more of the background. And so it'll look, depends on what story you're telling and where you are shooting an interview, you might not want that. So with lens compression, with a telephoto lens when you're shooting video, and when you're shooting in a studio like this, it can actually help you frame your subjects and build studios that are a bit cheaper because you don't need as much background space.
Exactly.
I had to use that for doing some things.
Absolutely, right? And then if we compare to the TV lenses, right, like the broadcast lenses, with my photography kit or my EOS R kit, I have 5 or 6 lenses going with me. You don't do that with the broadcast lenses because, again, they're $10,000 each, or 100,000 crowns each or more, right? So first of all, I don't want my staff changing the lenses, because if they break the bayonet on 100,000 Swedish kroner lens, it's not great. You don't want to get dust in. There's so many more problems. So when you start thinking about lens compression and distance from your subject, it starts to really become an important thought. What do I want in my background? How far back from my subject do I need to be? And then set location, how all that kind of comes into play in your story becomes even more important, because you only got the one lens, right?
Yeah.
So I hope that helped you guys understand a little bit about why we choose the lenses we choose, and helps you maybe think more about how you spend your money when you're choosing your lenses. Fred, thanks so much for being with us today.
Pleasure.
I hope you guys like and subscribe. If you have any more questions, please comment below, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks.